This is Top of Mind, the Dr. Patrick Slowinski Show.
All right. Welcome everybody to Top of Mind. It's been a minute, as we say in the States. We've had a tragedy that we have been dealing with on this show, and not just the show. I think the United States, a big part of the United States at least, and people all over the world have remembered what happened to Charlie Kirk just 2 weeks ago. And that was because of technology. That tragedy was available immediately, and it's forever embedded in the interwebs and in the minds of many people who saw that. And I can only hope and pray as a person of faith that something good comes out of that. But I think being angry and being upset are feelings people need to deal with um, initially as part of the grieving process. Um, I was very, very impressed with Mrs. Kirk, with Erica Kirk's ability to forgive the assassin. Um, and I know that she said that's what God would want her to do. But I did believe it was genuine. I do believe she's a person of faith who believes that, and that was tremendous. I don't know if I could ever be that kind of forgiving person if my spouse was killed in front of millions of people in perpetuity to watch over and over again throughout the years. So that had us take a little bit of a break. Paul O'Neill is here with us today, folks, and I'm going to introduce him in a second. Um, he's across the pond in the UK with his beautiful headsets on, with his headphones on, and he's here to join us. Paul O'Neill is a well-known expert in the field of national security. I promised that I wouldn't give into temptations and ask him a lot about British domestic politics, but what we really want him here is for tonight is talk about national security. We've had some time now to look at domestic threats in the United States, but there's also tremendous external threats for every country. The UN just UNGA was just happening. I don't think it's completed yet. President Trump spoke this week in a very, you know, which will go down as a very historical speech. I think every time President Trump goes to UNGA or to NATO or somewhere, it's going to be remembered because he takes such a different approach than people expected um, U.S. presidents to take in those big international settings. So we're going to play a clip on that in a second. But Paul, you were over at the Royal United Services Institute called, is it RUSI?
It is indeed, yes,
All
Patrick, and
right,
thank you for
RUSI.
allowing me to join you.
Yes, Paul. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, what you're working on now, and I will engage with you in a conversation on national security.
Okay, well, thank you once again for allowing me to join you. Um, I'm an associate at RUSI. My particular interest is in national security. Because my background is largely from the military, I spent a number of years in the British military, but primarily as an HR specialist. So I tend to come at national security through an organizational lens. And I do quite a bit of work on that. We've just had a strategic defence review published in the United Kingdom and a new national security strategy responding to the challenges, ironically, only 2 years since the last one. In part, I think there's a degree of performative management here with a new government in place wanting to assert its ownership of the national security agenda. But equally, I think the pace at which the world is changing, the threats are adapting, and many of the threats are aligning, means that traditional strategies that we might have expected to last for 5 or 10 years are now having to be replaced on an almost annual basis, it seems. And so it keeps somebody like me quite busy commentating on ever new documents coming out saying this is what the threat is and this is what we need to do about it.
Well, excellent. And Paul, just to our audience, is a well-known, well-published author on the field of national security. He does focus on his beloved UK and Europe, which makes a lot of sense. I want to talk a little bit about the traditional threats that people look at in terms of national security. And clearly, the Ukraine-Russia war, for many people, tends to be the turning point in how one conducts war. We've already seen what a dramatic role drones are playing already. What we're not seeing is the threats behind the scenes, the cyber attacks, the digital attacks, all sorts of other attacks that we're not seeing videotaped in traditional war zones. So I do have a clip here going back because our first national security question is how does what's going on in Ukraine and Russia affect us now? And us being our NATO partners, allies between the United States and UK, and our European friends, how that affects us, how it ends or how it continues. I hope it's the former, not the latter.
I've also been working relentlessly, stopping the killing in Ukraine. I thought that would be, of the 7 wars that I stopped, I thought that would be the easiest because of my relationship with President Putin, which had always been a good one. I thought that was going to be the easiest one. But, you know, in war, you never know what's going to happen. There are always lots of surprises, both good and bad. Everyone thought Russia would win this war in 3 days, but it didn't work out that way. It was supposed to be just a quick little skirmish. It's not making Russia look good. It's making them look bad. No matter what happens from here on out, this was something that should have taken a matter of days, certainly less than a week. And they've been fighting for 3.5 years and killing anywhere from 5,000 to 7,000 young soldiers, mostly soldiers, on both sides, every single week, from 5,000 to 7,000 dead young people.
All right, Paul. So back to you. So this is very recent this week, President Trump weighing in, taking a different approach that he's taken to the Russians, at least, which is understandable. He tried one approach was not to get him too upset, see if he'd come to the table. He can't definitely insult someone and tell them that they're the most evil person in the world and still try to get a deal with them. I think most people understood that. And now he's seeing it differently. So the Ukraine-Russia war that's been going on for 3 years, what when you study that, Paul, in your role as a national security expert, what do you see for us now in the short term and in the long term?
Well, it very much depends on what lens you take. If you were to look at it from a geostrategic perspective and say, what has Putin achieved? Then arguably he has been the best recruiting sergeant for NATO. And he has helped, alongside President Trump, deliver something that US presidents since John F. Kennedy have been trying to do, which is get Europe to take much more responsibility for its own defense. And so the desire to see, in 2014, I think 3 countries in NATO were spending 2% of GDP on defense. As at this year, it's all 32 member countries of NATO who are spending 2% of GDP, and they've all committed to increasing that. So arguably, what Putin has managed to do is not only increase the size of NATO with Sweden and Finland joining and sacrificing their traditional neutrality, which I think significantly strengthens the NATO alliance, but it also means that countries are now taking the threat quite seriously, and we've gone away from any pretense, I think, that we might have had the end of history at the end of the Cold War. And I think European nations are now waking up to the threat in a manner that was inconceivable 3 years ago. So I think on one hand, what you could argue is that the war has been a catalyzing influence on Europe taking its own security far more seriously than it has previously. And as I say, Europe has for a long time ridden on the coattails of the United States investment, and not unreasonably, the United States has other priorities, including that of China and the rise of China as a more existential threat to US position in the world. But of course, it's had a devastating effect on Ukraine and the population there. And it's also had a huge impact on the global economy. Countries have been applying sanctions, and that has impacted on their opportunity for growth. But I think the immediate challenge for us today is how do we continually apply pressure to Russia to get them to stop this illegal war? And the danger becomes one, if if it continues, I think Putin is rather hoping that we lose interest or we focus on something else because we haven't got the staying power. So I think strategic patience is one of those things that's going to test us. I think the moral outrage that exists is genuine. And we see in Europe, with Britain and France, this idea of coalition of the willing to provide support. The UK has signed a 100-year partnership with Ukraine. But behind all of that, we're still very dependent on the United States. And in fact, Donald Tusk from Poland came out recently in light of Donald Trump's recent statement about how he thinks that with European help, Ukraine can win this war and restore its original borders back to the pre-2014 position, which on one hand seems really quite positive and a very big change in US direction. But Donald Tusk is warning that if that means that the United States is now going to leave it to Europe on its own, then that is not going to put Ukraine in the position that it needs to be. So I think there are different perspectives on this, but it's good that President Trump is taking a view which is, I think, more focused on what Ukraine wants to get out of this and trying to be overly concerned by the view of President Putin. But on the other hand, you've got the concern that Donald Tusk has identified, which is if this means that America is now going to leave it to Europe, I don't think Europe is in a good position to provide the support that Ukraine needs without the United States.
I think that's a great analysis, and I do think that President Trump is treading carefully. He often speaks his mind extremely directly, and I think when people often say that he's playing 4D chess all the time, it may be true, but other times he's just being brutally honest that we don't often see in politicians. And one of the things he said from immediately is people are dying. I don't really care about the other stuff. Let me do the triage, stop the bleeding, stop the people dying. Then we can talk about the spoils of war. And I think that was an approach a lot of people resonated with. Let's go over to the UK and the Starmer government. What from your observations have been the UK approach to Ukraine and Russia, and where do you see that going in terms of a UK-Europe coalition, if you will?
Yeah, well, the Starmer government has actually been pretty resolute on Ukraine. But I would also be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the fact that actually a number of prime ministers ago, because we went into a habit of changing them quite frequently, not so long ago, Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who was then the prime minister, was one of the early European leaders to step up and stand firmly behind Ukraine. And that was continued even then with the very short premiership of Liz Truss and then Rishi Sunak before the election. And I think the Labour government has continued that sense of support, driven in large part by the fact that Europe has woken up to the threat of war on its continent, something that we should have seen as early as 2008 with Russia's invasion or engagement against Georgia. And then, of course, in 2014 with the initial Russian invasion of Crimea and Donbass. But Europe failed to respond coherently to either of those. And it was only the 2022 invasion and the war from 2022 that has really galvanized that attention. So I think credit to the Labour Party, they've done quite well, but it's largely been a continuation of policy that they inherited. They have continued to invest. There was an announcement recently by John Healey, the Secretary of State for Defence, about further investments into Ukraine in weapons systems and in non-lethal aid. And we've seen similar statements being made by France and Germany and others in Europe. My nervousness, though, and my criticism of European governments, including the British government, would be, whilst they're doing what they can, I don't see as much enthusiasm or effort being invested in expanding what it is they can do. And I think we are still, as I said before, still very dependent on the United States for industrial defense capacity. And we have not had the same alacrity in releasing contracts into industry to build replacement systems. So I would say it's a mixed scorecard for the Labour government. They've been resolute, they've been continuing the policy, and I don't think there's any doubt about their political commitments. I do think we have struggled more than we should have 3.5 years into actually expanding our capacity to do more for Ukraine to help them win, which is in Europeans' security interests fundamentally.
Right. So I don't know, you and I have not talked a lot, just exchanged emails and have mutual friends. So I don't know if you know my Polish background, but in addition to having a very Polish name, I'm quite connected to Poland. I have relatives there. I speak Polish. I have a very big connection with Poland and the Nawrocki government, which I believe President Trump calls Nawrocki. But that's the way we would pronounce it in the United States. So he's not incorrect. So the Nawrocki, I just can't say it that way. The Nawrocki government has taken a little bit different. Just so people know, when you talked about Prime Minister Tusk, the president is Karol Nawrocki, a conservative, very strong conservative, by the way, seen more as on the not the far right, but very right. Very Catholic, very open about traditional values and keeping Europe in check. I bring up Poland because they're right there, one could argue, because Belarus, it's obvious what camp they're in. But one can argue in terms of the Western NATO coalition. Poland has the most to lose in many respects. Even the latest dancing with drones, whatever that was Poland. And, there's a lot of bad history, centuries old, between those two former empires. And so you have that and you don't ever have a Polish person who's over 40 years old who trusts anything that comes out of Moscow or Kaliningrad, right? And it's something that as someone who's studied Poland for a long time, do you see a shift because of the urgency with Russia? Do you see a shift in the NATO politics, if you will? Germany doesn't have the pole position anymore. I would argue it's Poland, at least from a U.S. perspective. So tell us a little bit about what you see in NATO going forward. I agree with you. I think it's good people are paying their fair share a little bit more. The proof is in the pudding, as we say, and we'll see how much they actually pay. No one's expecting Canada to pay. But I digress. I want to go over to you about your state of play with NATO. Do you really believe, from all your studies and observing this space for a long time, that they are willing to really understand after the 3-year war that this could be them next?
I think there's a genuine sense of that. And just to pick on Poland,
Please
Poland
do.
is probably the poster child for NATO at the moment. If you look at the latest report NATO have produced about spending by country, then Poland is spending more as a percentage of GDP than any other country, and it's genuinely taking this seriously. It's rapidly expanding its armed forces to
You
the
blame
extent.
them, with
I'm sorry?
the law of proximity, right? They're right
Yeah,
there.
yeah, no, absolutely. But even its shift, it's always been there, adjacent to the threat, but actually its speed of movement has been very impressive, to the extent it's gone to South Korea and bought equipment off the shelf, and it is doing things that if you were running a peacetime efficient military you wouldn't do, which is having multiple fleets of tanks. So they're buying the Abrams and they're also buying South Korean tanks, but that's a way of building mass fast. So I think Poland is doing a really good job in responding to the threat. And you can understand why that's the case, exactly as you said. But equally, it is responding in a way that some other NATO members have not responded despite the threat. And as I would say, as I have said, even going back as far as 2008, when we saw the Russia's engagement in Georgia and the war there, and still 20% of Georgia is occupied by Russian troops. So this isn't a 3-year problem. This is something that goes back a long way before then. And Europe did not respond effectively. I think the other change I've seen in NATO in recent years is the accession of Finland and Sweden,
Yes.
which of course,
Unexpected for me.
indeed,
That quick, that speed, when they had
yeah.
so many years talking about it.
No, absolutely. And what that has done, I think, is it's moved the central political focus north and east. Whereas I remember talking to NATO defense colleges years ago, and in the audience, you would have those who were in the north would talk about Russia, and those who were in the south would talk about migration across the Mediterranean as being the big issue facing NATO. And I think what we're now seeing is a much stronger focus on Russia as a threat, the strategic concept that NATO produced a couple of years ago, the Sakhar's plans, the deterrence in the Euro-Atlantic area, is all signifying a greater focus on a state-based adversary. So there has genuinely been a change, and I can see entirely why the United States would regard Poland as a critical ally in this, because Germany, despite the Zeitenwende that has been announced, this 1 billion euros, has been slow to deliver. And of course, with the German armed forces, there have been challenges in those armed forces, and therefore, even investing significant sums doesn't necessarily buy you much new capability. It might just help fix some of the gaps. Whereas Poland is the one, I think, that is leading the way of traditional NATO members.
Right, and I think it would be remiss of us not to discuss the historical relationship between Poland and the United States. I mean, it's a game changer in many respects because you have a different attitude between those two countries. The United States doesn't enjoy the kind of almost unconditional love, if you will, it enjoys from Poland from other European countries. To that extent, we have over 10 million Polish Americans in the United States who vote. They were a large vote for President Trump this time around. You also have history going back to our American Revolution between, Kazimierz Puławski, and then you have Tadeusz Kościuszko, who were generals and mercenaries who left their lands and came to the United States to fight in the Revolutionary War for the United States. So that goes back a long way. You had President Trump inviting Karol Nawrocki, the candidate for president of Poland, to the Oval Office before the election. And so you see that kind of very close relationship with President Trump, inviting a candidate for president into his office a week or two before the election. That was a big deal. And as Poland is getting a lot of that American love because of the longstanding relationship, and they've been willing to support the United States no matter who was president. And I'll be honest, Trump derangement syndrome is real in Europe. There are people that just can't get past his style, being bombastic and being off the cuff and being rude or whatever they think it is, but however they characterize it, they just do not like him. And so it's very difficult for them to think they can get a deal with him. So, but you see Poland understanding who's driving the train. And it's still, as you mentioned, the United States. So I think it would behoove the other countries, if they want to see real progress in NATO, to take a page from the Poles and say, how can we actually do business and have the United States on our sides? If their goals are really to beef up their ammunitions, beef up their weaponry, beef up maybe some training, but they still need the United States, clearly.
I think that's true. And oddly enough, I've just been reading a biography of Brzezinski as the National Security Advisor to President Carter. So, and again, the support the United States provided to the Solidarity movement and Polish independence with the collapse of the Soviet Union. So I see entirely the point you're making. My only challenge, I suppose, a gentle challenge to you on that would be, I think it's also important that Europe tries to develop some kind of strategic autonomy. And I don't mean in the sense of perhaps the way President Macron might mean it and ignoring the United States. But the idea that Europe should be able to do more for itself and not just be in a better relationship with the United States, but still dependent on it. Because the reality is, for the United States, your big threat is China. Russia isn't. Somebody once described it to me, I think quite nicely, which is Russia is bad weather and China is climate change, as a way of thinking about the nature of the problem. So Europe needs to be better at working through its own resources but it also does absolutely need a good working relationship with the United States. And the UK probably sees that more than most, because our geography does put us literally between the United States and mainland Europe. But it is also quite close to Europe. And you raised the spectre of Brexit earlier, which we probably ought to come to at some point. But I do think Europe needs to take more responsibility for its own security, because it's not inconceivable that the United States may well be focused on what is happening in the Indo-Pacific and the Taiwan Straits at the same time as something even more serious for the majority of European nations is happening within Europe itself. And so it can't rely on the US to come to its aid, because not unreasonably the US has other priorities and ought to invest in those other priorities.
Well, you hit the nail on the head in terms of segues. And I did for our second national security topic. It's China. Often we hear, and I don't know if these are people who are always having their glass more than half full, depending on what beverage is in the glass. But they often believe that, China's just going to implode economically. They can't continue at their pace. Don't really have to worry about them. They're a lot of bluster. They're not going to invade Taiwan. They don't have the resources to do it. I don't believe that. And I think that some people have viewed the Ukraine-Russian 3-year war now as a serious distraction from the real threat, not only to the United States, but to all of our partners, including the UK, and that's China. So what are you guys seeing at RUSI in terms of the national security threat for the West from China?
It's pretty clear that China has a different view of how the world ought to be organized than most of us in Western Europe and in the United States. So I think to that extent it poses challenges. I think as well there is always the danger with modernization of the Chinese military, the rapid expansion of their nuclear capabilities, that this isn't being done without a sense of at some stage they may have to engage in conflict, either to forcibly reintegrate Taiwan, as they would describe it, into the mainland, or indeed in any other way. But I think China does pose a threat. That's slightly different to the UK official position. We're still struggling in the UK to describe China as a threat. It is a challenge, because in some respects, the UK has been dependent on Chinese investment. There was a huge issue with Huawei and the 5G network in the UK at one point, and it was the United States' strong opposition to that eventually caused the Conservative government of the time to change its policy about Huawei providing a lot of the infrastructure for 5G in this country. But we haven't yet moved to the same state that the United States has in terms of describing China in a very binary kind of way. I must admit I'm less convinced by timescales than the United States official policy seems to be. This idea of the Davidson window, that between 27 and 32 is the optimum time for China to move against Taiwan in a forcible manner. Partly because I think China's doing remarkably well at the moment anyway, without having to force that particular issue. And I think there are some technical issues about their own modernization that may not make them quite ready in that kind of time period. The big worry becomes one of miscalculation or misinterpretation of action, either Chinese misinterpreting actions taken by Western nations going through the South China Sea, irresponsible buzzing by aircraft of warships that might be perceived as being a threat, or indeed the United States and its allies misinterpreting something that the Chinese may be doing. So I think there is a risk of miscalculation here. I'm not an economist, but my worry for China would be more demographic. I'm revealing my HR background here perhaps as well. But China's disastrous one-child policy is going to cause, I think, a huge challenge, because Xi has created a middle class and done a remarkable job in bringing people out of poverty in huge numbers. But they will expect to have that kind of level of support. And if you don't have the population to generate the wealth to sustain it, I think the demographics might well drive the economics. And then you may end up with some internal pressures. And as we know, the People's Liberation Army is not the Chinese army. It's the army of the Chinese Communist Party, and its job is to keep the Chinese Communist Party in power. So I think the risk of implosion exists as well.
That demographic point is, I think, overlooked a lot. When people mentioned that India, for the first time not too long ago, had surpassed China in terms of population, they were freaking out. I wasn't freaking out at all, because we see the effects of this policy, the one-child policy, coming home to roost, if you will. And that policy did not exist in India. It doesn't mean that India does not have its own long way to go to reduce the tremendous poverty that it's dealing with. But still, it is an effect. I think for us domestically here, we see very much China as an adversary because of the traditional espionage, the commercial espionage, buying our farms, buying our strategic properties, or even buying something so they can get close to send a weather balloon up. So we have, I think, enough evidence to be very clear about how China views us, and that's clearly, I would say, as an adversary. Mm-hmm. And as you mentioned, it's two completely different ways of looking at how we should live this life, and how one's country should develop and grow and act and behave. Clearly, China has different ethical terms in terms of business than we do in the West.
And indeed managing its own population.
Right, and that has stifled our ability to keep them at bay. It really has. And so the economic advantage that China has grasped in record time, I don't see that dissipating anytime soon. I did study economics. And in the State Department, when I was a diplomat, I was an economic officer. So I've looked at China very carefully through the years. China will come into, we call that China Inc. model, right? They'll just come in and take over, buy up things, and hold on to them for strategic purposes. Develop them if it makes sense, but just hold on to them and use them as leverage, whether that's mining assets, oil and gas, any kind of resource-based asset that they can get their hands on. When I was in Afghanistan, there were arguably more Chinese business people running around parts of Afghanistan than soldiers. Than ISAF soldiers. So, that was disheartening to see how much they had come in, and now that we have China, operating Bagram, I mean, what a slap in the face. Yeah. So we cannot overlook the trajectory of over the years of what the adversarial threat that we have from China. But there are more threats out there. There's more national security threats out there. I spend a lot of time looking at digital and cyber threats, the drones, and I just want to spend a little bit of time on the change of state of warfare in terms of national security. Ukraine and Russia has been kind of I would say a clumsy prototype, but getting much less clumsy in the effectiveness of these tools. So I know that's scary for people to hear, but I think it's worth a few minutes of your thoughts on the changing state of warfare with not just drones, but other technologies.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I suppose one of the dangers of any war that's lasted for as long as Russia's war against Ukraine is that you can often find any lesson you want from it. So very early on, artillery was still the king of battle and was still killing more people than drones. We now see a situation where drones are proving more and more lethal, and artillery seems to be less so. But in part, that could be attributable to the fact that the West has largely run out of the provision of artillery shells, so Ukraine isn't firing quite as many artillery shells. And the best way of fighting is through drones. So not unsurprisingly, the lethality rate of drones appears to be much better than that of artillery. Now, that might be just because more of them are being used, not that they are necessarily more efficient. But certainly, I think what we're seeing, and it plays to Ukraine's advantage to some extent, given the relatively small size of its population in comparison to Russia, is drones and the like allow one person to control multiple effectors, whereas traditionally in warfare, one person has been one effector. And I think what we're seeing now has changed that significantly. It's also changing the price point of warfare. When we look at the cost of first-person view drones, much cheaper than many of the traditional military capabilities, and therefore mass becomes a viable prospect, which isn't then in a linear relationship between the number of people in your forces that you need to deliver it. So there's definitely that. Interestingly, it was actually the Azerbaijan-Armenia war where drones first played a part a few years beforehand. But we're seeing a very big change in Ukraine from the Bayraktar type of drone that Turkey was providing to Ukraine. It was doing particularly well early on, but now the battle space has become far more complicated through electronic warfare mechanisms, something I regret to say Russia has an edge on over NATO. The ability to operate in electronic or to create an electronic warfare hostile environment is something they are far better than NATO is. And that's something NATO will need to catch up on.
Yeah, it's something Poland is very focused on, given recent events.
Yes, indeed. And of course, Ukraine has been very successful in the context of maritime operations as well. So it's managed to largely defeat a Russian Black Sea fleet without actually having any ships of its own through the use of autonomy. So that has, I think, changed things. We've also seen some very sophisticated attacks by Ukraine deep into Russia, with small drones smuggled in through individuals, able to set up on air bases and oil refineries and things thousands of miles away and deliver effects.
Beyond Kursk, right? Beyond the Kursk region.
Yes, indeed. Yes. So Engels was attacked as a strategic bomber base, for example. We've seen attacks on railroad systems, communication systems that would move the logistics forward for Russia. The oil refinery attacks that are being done by Ukraine that's impacting significantly on Russian ability to export and therefore to fund its war machine. So I think there are substantial changes. But we also need to be careful that we don't dismiss traditional military capabilities in favor of searching for the new. But I suppose that would be my point. Yes, embrace the new, but equally, let's not throw everything out and think it's completely different to the way it has been before.
Well, thank you so much for that, Paul. In an ever-changing world where we're having ever-changing ways of dealing with our conflicts with each other, and I hope that at the end of the day, you and I talk about warfare capabilities and don't have to see them for ourselves or our families or friends. Thank you so much, Paul, for spending time with us today on Top of Mind. Ladies and gentlemen, again, Paul O'Neill with us visiting from the UK, national security expert, subject matter expert. Paul, you're welcome anytime, and God bless you and the UK there, and be safe.
Thank you, Patrick, and to you, and amen to your prayer about war.
Thank you. Thank you.
In a world full of noise, clarity is power. Stay informed, stay aware, stay top of mind.